Christmas with a special portrait of the prolific and much-loved novelist P.G. Wodehouse.
P.G. Wodehouse is England's best-loved humorous writer. He died at Remsenburg, Long Island in 1975 at the age of 93. The author of over 100 books, he was admired not only by readers the world over, but also by his fellow writers. Evelyn Waugh called him the head of my profession.
I'll tell you what he did, actually, the thing. You can never, I think, you can never write a simile in a comic novel without being aware that this has been done better, and you know, in fact, you better keep clear of similes. I mean, Wodehouse more or less killed them. I mean, after, you know, she had laughter like, you know, a troop of cavalry, you know, galloping across a tin bridge. I mean, this sort of stuff. I mean, you know, you're stuck with it. Every time you come to a word like, I fade away, I keep well away from it.
Although Wodehouse spent much of his working life in America, he, more than anyone, made Englishness universal. But it's a carefully created England. His legendary characters, Jeeves, Bertie Wooster and Lord Emsworth, are the product of hours of hard, solitary work.
But it was the way he wanted to live. He used to work in the morning, go for a walk in the afternoon, and work again in the evening. Then in the evening he had a cocktail and watched a soap opera. And that was his life, and he never wanted to alter it. Well, that means that he spent two-thirds of the waking day, anyway, in the company of Jeeves and Bertie Wooster. And that's where he belonged, in a way.
Tonight's bookmark looks at the life and work of this immensely dedicated writer and follows him through the war years as his timeless, uniquely imagined world collided with reality in its crudest, most uncompromising form. In 1940, a few months before his 59th birthday, Wodehouse was at the height of his literary career. Recently awarded an honorary doctorate by Oxford University, he was living, as he had since the outbreak of the war, at the French provincial town of Le Touquet. Reluctant to return to England because he would have had to leave his beloved dogs in quarantine, Wodehouse and his wife put their trust in the French army and entertained British airmen at their villa, Low Wood, just outside Le Touquet.
He was not exactly shy, but he was a loner, and he loved people to be enjoying himself in his house, exactly like she did. But he would, for instance, if we were dancing to the gramophone or chatting or eating or having a little drink, he would suddenly put his head, there it is, through this door, which led to his...
door here?
Yes, this door here, and which, there's a little passage through here which leads to the room where he used to do all his writing. And he'd open this door and look round with his sweet smile and very short-sighted glasses and say, "Is everybody happy?" And we'd say, "Yes, thank you very much." And the young men would say, "Why don't you come and join us, sir?" And he said, "No, thank you very much, but I think I'll go back to my work," and he did.
Threatened by the approach of an invading army, they tried to get out, but it was too late. Wodehouse took refuge in his work and viewed the advancing Germans without relinquishing any of his very English irony.
Young men setting out in life have often asked me, how can I become an internee? Well, there are several ways. You can be a grocer in Douai, or a farm labourer at Ambricourt, or a coal miner at Lille. You can be one of the crew of a liner which has been sunk by enemy destroyers. You can be a war grave gardener in the war cemeteries of France. Or, like me, you can settle down in a villa at Le Touquet and get stuck there until the place is occupied. That is as simple a method as any. You buy the villa, and the Germans do the rest. One's reactions on finding oneself suddenly surrounded by the armed strength of a hostile power are rather interesting. The first time you see a German soldier in your garden, your impulse is to jump 10 feet straight up into the air, and you do so. But this feeling of embarrassment soon passes. A week later, you find yourself only jumping 5 feet, And in the end, familiarity so breeds indifference that you're able to sustain without a tremor the spectacle of men in steel helmets riding round your lawn on bicycles, and even the discovery that 2 or 3 of them have dropped in and are taking a bath in your bathroom. The motto of the German army in occupied territory is, "What's yours is mine," and any nonsense about an Englishman's home being a castle is soon dispelled.
Plum had been to see the consul about 3 days before, and the consul said, "That's all right, don't worry, they won't get through the merry-no line," and so on. So Plum went back to his books and Ethel to her gardening or whatever it was. And then next thing they knew, the Germans on motorcycles in their garden. And after a month or two, all the British citizens in Le Touquet, which included the billiard marker, the golf pro, a few barmen and so on, were rounded up, under 60 of war-making age, were rounded up and taken off to civilian internment. And that included old Plum, who was 58.
We, for some reason, were allowed to go home and put a few things together, and as my home was 3 kilometers away and an early start desired, I was actually sent there in a car. It took a little of the edge off the uplifted mood caused by this luxury to discover on arriving that the soldier who was escorting me had expected me to be snappy. My idea had been to have a cold shower and a change, and then light a pipe and sit down and muse for a while, deciding in a calm and unhurried spirit what to take and what could be left behind. His seemed to be that 5 minutes was ample. Eventually we compromised on 10. I would like my biographers to make a careful note of the fact that the very first thought that occurred to me was that here was my first chance to buckle down and read the complete works of William Shakespeare. Reading the complete works of William Shakespeare was a thing I'd been meaning to do any time these last 40 years, but about 3 years previously I'd bought the Oxford edition for that purpose. But you know how it is. I did not know what internment implied. It might be for years, or it might be a mere matter of weeks. But the whole situation seemed to point to the complete works of Shakespeare, so in they went.
No, we didn't hear anything for quite a while, except that we heard that he'd been interned, that's all. Yes. But, you know, we thought, well, interned is not imprisoned, it's kept under restraint, but that's all.
The eminent writer, now surrounded by a hostile German army, was born in 1881, Pelham Greville Wodehouse, the son of Ernest Wodehouse, a colonial magistrate in Hong Kong.
He was a judge in Hong Kong, and my grandmother went out to visit her brother in Hong Kong on what they called the fishing fleet. She went out fishing for her husband, and she caught him. Yes. And in 1877?
Mm. Yes, we've got a lovely picture of that wedding over there.
Yeah.
But, the fishing fleet, that was to get a husband.
Yes, it was a standard technique.
It's the only way they could get them married, you say. There weren't enough men in England.
Well, it wasn't that. There weren't enough women in Hong Kong, except the yellow ones, and they were taboo.
Oh, well, they were on the side.
Well, we won't talk about that.
No,
His parents lived in Hong Kong, and when the eldest brother, who was by then about 6, was sent home, they made a sort of wholesale job of it and sent the lot. And Plum at that time was only 2. And after that, he never really had a home, you know, of any sort.
Wodehouse's mother, Eleanor Dean, the daughter of a West Country vicar, was the mother of 4 sons.
She just had the 4 boys. Peveril, Philip,
John,
Armin,
Ernest Armin, Pelham Grenville, and Richard Lancelot Dean. Yes, they had a fine assembly of names.
Yes, she liked all that, didn't she?
Yes.
They are fantastic names, aren't
Yes,
they?
oh yes.
Yes.
She was fantastic.
She was fantastic. In what way?
Well, she was a little bit of a martinet, wasn't
Oh,
she?
yes.
Yes. Very straight. But
I mean, it's
really,
servants walked in letter one day. She was only a very young girl, this housemaid, and she told her to go out again and bring it in on the salver. I could have hit her.
she just brought in
I
and
could have
handed
hit
a
her.
letter.
And the
you see.
poor girl, face went red. I thought you were hateful or something. But I never forgot that. I thought it was so awful.
The fact that your parents were abroad so much at the time, does that account for there being so few fathers and mothers in your books?
Well, I can't very well use father and mother as a menace. It's rather unpleasant, you know, if a son doesn't get on with his father and mother, but an aunt is something you can make fun of.
Ah, Agatha!
Answering the door these days, Bertie. Well, I'm glad to see that you're taking some exercise. Good morning, Jeeves.
Morning, Mrs. Spencer Gregson. Would you care for some coffee, madam?
Oh, thank you. I don't really want any. Jeeves makes the worst coffee in London. I sometimes think he must grind the beans with his heel.
I used a phrase in the book I wrote in which it said the springs of love are frozen by the rejection in childhood, so that you have this person who is really not like other people and lives in an imaginative world of their own, and the springs of love are frozen, so they have very little communication, powers of communication. That's what Plum was like.
The Wodehouse world is not, however, quite as simple as it at first appears. Lieutenant Colonel Norman Murphy, an author and retired army officer, is convinced that the locations of Wodehouse's novels are very firmly rooted in fact. So convinced is he of his thesis that earlier this year he took a party of American tourists across Shropshire and Worcestershire in search of Wodehouse country.
We're going down to Hanley Castle and Upton-on-Severn. I believe I pronounced that right. And where else, I'm really not sure, but all down in the Wodehouse triangle down there.
How do you like England, Miss Bennet? Billy's eye had lost its cheerful friendliness, and a somewhat feline expression had taken its place. Pretty well, she replied. You don't like it? Well, the way I look at it is this. It's no use grumbling. One's got to realize that in England one is in a savage country, and one should simply be thankful one isn't eaten by the natives. What makes you call England a savage country? Demanded Sam, a staunch patriot, deeply stung. Well, what else would you call a country where you can't get ice, central heating, corn on the cob, or bathrooms?
Mr. Collis, you told me once something about the lawn outside there.
Yes, that was laid down by P.G. Woodhouse's father.
As a?
As a croquet lawn, a full-size croquet lawn.
Thank you.
Do you know anything else about P.G. Woodhouse?
What?
Yeah.
Do what?
Do you know anything else about P.G. Woodhouse here? Can you tell us?
He lived here. P.G. Woodhouse's father was a judge in Hong Kong, and he came here retired and came here in 1900. And he was here for about 6 years with P.G. Woodhouse, of course, as a boy.
Are any of the furniture or anything left from those days?
The furniture? He left it about 1906.
You know these English houses, so the furniture been hanging around the same.
I've been here for 52 years.
Was Wodehouse in any sense an autobiographical writer? The mystery surrounding the sources of his inspiration, whether in early childhood or later at his public school, is compounded by his public manner. He defended his privacy by not, in public anyway, giving any clue as to what he really felt.
The three essentials for an autobiography are that its compiler shall have had an eccentric father and a miserable, misunderstood childhood and had a hell of a time at his public school. and I enjoyed none of these advantages. My father was as normal as rice pudding. My childhood went like a breeze from start to finish, with everyone I met understanding me perfectly, while as for my school days at Dulwich, they were just 6 years of unbroken bliss. It would be laughable of me to attempt a formal autobiography. I have not got the material.
Wodehouse loved it here. In all his school stories, they are set in the school of Dulwich, but he moved the whole school in imagination up here to Shropshire. So if you look at village names around here, Ryton, Rowton, Warfield, Beckbury, these are villages around here, and he gave those names to schools in his stories.
I think Dulwich was the first place that he felt was like home. He was there for 6 years, and he always described it as 6 years of unbroken bliss. I think knowing what one does about public schools, one must take that with a pinch of salt. But I think a lot is due to A.H. Gilkes, who was the headmaster then, who Plum described as standing 6'6" in his socks, wearing a long white beard and scaring the pants off all of them. But there's no doubt that he had a considerable influence on Plum.
We know, certainly with Chandler, and Wodehouse and Chandler only missed one another by a summer holiday, that they would go through a piece of work in Latin. He would get them to come back a few days later, having translated into Greek, and then they would translate it into some other language, and then back into the original, and see how, through their knowledge of the language structures, how that would have changed from the original.
Yes, good. I have to stop you there. What have we said there about the G?
Trevor was due at the headmaster's private house at 6 o'clock on the present Tuesday. He was looking forward to the ordeal, not without apprehension. The essay's subject had been, "One man's meat is another man's poison." And he had begun with, "While I cannot conscientiously go so far as to say that one man's meat is another man's poison, yet I am certainly of the opinion that what is highly beneficial to one man may, on the other hand, to another man differently constituted, be extremely deleterious and indeed absolutely fatal." Trevor was not at all sure how the headmaster would take it.
Neuter, so it's omnia parata errant, both neuter plural, nominative.
57, somewhere around about there, I went over and saw him. And we were talking about books, and he asked me to send him a copy of Suetonius' 12 Caesars, which I did. But it showed that he didn't only read whodunits.
He read Shakespeare all the time and urged me to read it. I remember he was quite disappointed when he discovered that I couldn't read Greek, which he apparently could speak, well, probably not as well as English, but he didn't exactly reprove me for not having a completely classical education, but pointed out that I'd better do the best I jolly well could myself. He was always reading his Shakespeare.
Wodehouse and his fellow internees were taken in a cattle truck across northern France to Liège prison, and from there to the citadel of Huy in Belgium. Even in the middle of what must have been a frightening and mysterious journey, Wodehouse, the complete professional writer, did not stop taking notes.
The citadel of Huy is one of those show places they charge you 2 francs to go into at times of peace. I believe it was actually built in the time of the Napoleonic Wars, but its atmosphere is purely medieval. It looks down on the River Meuse from the summit of a mountain, the sort of mountain some medieval sculptor would love to carve pictures on, and it's one of those places where, once you're in, you're in. Its walls are 14 feet thick, and the corridors are lighted at bays, in which are narrow slits of windows. August the 3rd, first night at Huy. Arrived 4:30. Glad to be out of our cattle trucks, but things don't look too good. They've put 40 of us in a room large enough for about 15. No beds, not even straw on the floor. I'm writing this at 8:30, half an hour before lights out, and it looks as if we should have to sit up all night. Our first night was not so bad as I thought it was going to be. At the last moment, we were moved into a larger room, and somebody suddenly remembered that there was straw in the cellars, so we went and fetched it. 110 steps down, and the same up. There was only enough to form a very thin deposit on the floor, and it stank to heaven. Still, it was straw. No blankets. Tough is the adjective I would use to describe the whole of these 5 weeks at Uy. The first novelty of internment had worn off, and we'd become acutely alive to the fact that we were in the soup and likely to stay there for a considerable time. The German soldiers themselves are all right. Being cooped up with them, and in this small place, you see a lot of them, and they're always friendly. They're all elderly reservists longing to get home to their wives and children, whose photographs they constantly show us, and they sympathize with us. One of them gave me his soup yesterday. This new lot of Germans is simply baffled as to who on earth we are. Why Germany should think it worth it to round up and corral a bunch of spavined old deadbeats like myself and the rest of us is beyond me to imagine. The whole thing reminds me of a rather tougher version of the old school. Mike wandered out of the house in Acacia Grove. A few steps took him to the railings that bounded the college grounds. It was late August, and the evenings had begun to close in. The cricket field looked very cool and spacious in the dim light, the school buildings looming vague and shadowy through the light mist. The little gate by the railway bridge was not locked. He went in and walked slowly across the turf towards the big clump of trees which marked the division between the cricket and the football fields. It was all very pleasant and soothing after the pantomime dame and her stuffy bed sitting room. He sat down on a bench beside the second 11 telegraph board and looked across the ground at the pavilion. For the first time that day, he began to feel really homesick. The clock on the tower over the senior block chimed quarter after quarter, but Mike sat on, thinking. It was quite late when he got up and began to walk back to Acacia Grove. He felt cold and stiff and very miserable.
He loved the school very dearly.
And you don't think that when your school, that there's something to be said for the argument that when your school days are over, they're over?
Well, they are, but they'll always be with you, particularly if they're happy, and sometimes if they're not happy.
Wodehouse remained obsessed with his old school for years after he'd left, and as late as the 1930s was reviewing school cricket matches for the Dulwich College magazine.
Hammond did us proud. He, alone on the side, played the right game. He wasted no time but got going at once with a grand drive to the boundary. Bailey, who'd been in a sort of coma for about an hour and 20 minutes, got a fort leg.
I was at boarding school, and then went to university and went to Oxford. And I think that was one of the things in his life that he was sad about, that he hadn't got to Oxford. I mean, his elder brother done so well there, the double first and winning the Newdigate. He undoubtedly would have got a scholarship there, but then in those days, there wasn't state support, and even though he would have got help from a scholarship, his father apparently lost money speculating in the rupee, and he couldn't afford to send him there.
But he did, this is ask you about yours when you were a boarder, so he'd say...
Oh, very much so, yes. Oh, in the fullest detail. I think more so than anyone else I've discussed one's school life with.
And what sort of questions would he ask you about it?
Oh, just for day-to-day life. That was fascinated him. The sort of team spirit in the house.
Please sit down.
Aren't I going up to Cambridge, Father? Stammered Mike. I'm afraid not, Mike. I'd manage it if I possibly could. I'm just as anxious to see you get your blue as you are to get it, but it's kinder to be quite frank. I can't afford to send you to Cambridge. I won't go into details which you wouldn't understand, but I've lost a very large sum of money since I saw you last, so large that we shall have to economize in every way. I shall let this house and take a much smaller one, and you and Bob, I'm afraid, will have to start earning your living. I know it's a terrible disappointment to you, old chap. Oh, that's all right, said Mike thickly. There seemed to be something sticking in his throat, preventing him from speaking. If there was any possible way... No, it's all right, Father, really. I don't mind a bit. It's awfully rough luck on you losing all that. There was another silence. The clock ticked away energetically on the mantelpiece. Thanks, Mike, said Mr. Jackson, as Mike started to leave the room. You're a sportsman.
I suppose it was like being in a large public school populated by adults instead of children. There was a camp captain, that's right. The German was the camp commandant with all his Sonderführers and second-in-command, and then there was a camp captain and a deputy camp captain and floor wardens and room wardens. Of course, he goes into all this in performing Flea, doesn't he?
And were some of them rather strict? I mean, where did Plum fit in? He was a sort of senior boy, really. He was a sixth former.
No, I think he made it perfectly clear that he didn't want to have any official position in the camp whatsoever. But he was always treated as just rather special.
Some people do feel about Wodehouse is that he was part of a vanished species of Englishman. And he was very much of the top class. And he didn't understand how ordinary people lived and worked. Did he seem to you to be remote from the realities?
No, I disagree completely with that. He was friendly with everybody in the camp. And, you know, if you read his books, he has an insight into how people of every class lived. And certainly it was not until a few months ago when I read Norman Murphy's book that I realised he had the faintest connection with the aristocracy. He never gave me that impression at all. There were people in the camp who did, but not Plum. Plum was one of us.
There is a lively argument Claude Coburn's advanced in the Homage to Wodehouse book about political views of Wodehouse. For instance, is Jeeves an agent of the ruling class or actually working secretly for the proletariat?
The old misconception, which seems possible now, we've been so brainwashed by the so-called socialist revolution, if you like, we forget that up to 1939, to have a job as a servant in a great house, as a butler or a housemaid or a valet, was one of the most enviable jobs you could get.
Prior to 1914, the butler was a cross between a gentleman and a roustabout, because he wore striped trousers, a tailcoat, dress coat. Let me show you exactly what he wore.
So, is that the jacket that you would have worn to Lady Wodehouse?
That's right. That's the kind of thing that we would have worn then. Silk reveres and everything. I mean, half evening and half morning. I mean, it was utterly ridiculous. And even some of them even wore the tailcoat, you know, the full-dress tailcoat.
My acquaintance with butlers and my awe of them started at a very early age. My parents were in Hong Kong most of the time, and when I was in the Knickerbocker stage and during my school holidays, I was passed from aunt to aunt. A certain number of these aunts were the wives of clergymen, which meant official calls at the local great house, and when they paid these calls, they took me along. Why, I have never been able to understand. For even at the age of 10, I was a social bust, contributing little or nothing to the feast of reason and flow of soul beyond shuffling my feet and kicking the leg of the chair on which loving hands had dumped me. There always came a moment when my hostess, smiling one of those painful smiles, suggested that it would be nice for your little nephew to go and have tea in the servants' hall, and she was right. I loved it. My mind today is fragrant with memories of kindly footmen and vivacious parlourmaids. In their society, I forgot to be shy and kidded back and forth with the best of them.
Good afternoon, sir. Would you come in?
I'm so sorry, Sir Humphrey. I do hope my man... Where is he?
That was not Sir Humphrey Warder, sir?
Oh, some itinerant circular or hawker, repelled with relish, I hope, Jeeves.
Well, I think I should warn you, sir.
No, now look, I think that I should warn you, Jeeves. Sir Humphrey is a sort of janitor in a loony bin.
Consultant neurologist is the term, I believe, sir.
Is it? Oh, very possibly. Anyway, Jeeves, Sir Humphrey's opinion of the eligible bachelors who have previously made a play for his daughter's hand is not much higher than the pile on that carpet. I flatter myself that I can speedily convince him that Marion has not drawn another congenital idiot to her bosom, but I will be obliged, Jeeves, if you would bear in mind that he drinks no wine, strongly disapproves of smoking, and is president of the West London branch of the Anti-Gambling League.
Well, sir, it is not my common practice, sir, to smoke on duty or to discuss anti-post prices with your guests.
A butler is a confidant to his governor. He's a friend to the family. The boss will often discuss things of a most intimate nature with his butler because he knows that a butler is the very epitome of tact and discretion.
Where does Jeeves come from?
Oh, Jeeves is stock character. You could take him back to the, I'm told, I don't speak Italian, Commedia dell'arte, that there was always a clever valet, probably a bit of a crook. He certainly, when I was made to read Greek at school, he came into the Greek to Aristophanes and so on. There was the clever servant of the foolish young man.
Jeeves? Yes, sir.
Oh! Jeeves, how did you know I needed one of your hangover cures?
The clothing that you were wearing last night, sir, covers a considerable area of the bedroom floor.
Oh. It was a pretty heavy night, Jeeves. Still well worth it to get rid of those two young fiends. Did you dispatch them on time, Jeeves?
Yes, I did, sir.
Oh, what time is it now?
It is just on 1 o'clock, sir.
Oh, splendid. Our Claude and Eustace will be leaning on the rail of the liner, taking a last glimpse of the dear old homeland. And the dear old homeland will at this moment be looking back at them and breathing a sigh of relief.
Hello, Bertie.
Lord!
It's the Nut, K-N-U-T style, which I think one can find in Punch and elsewhere in the early years of the century before that, I think in the 90s. The vague, young, probably rather rich second, third son of an aristocrat with a receding chin and butter-coloured hair. These are Plum's own sort of descriptions of the Nut.
What sort of things does the Nut say?
Well, he had a lot of evasive slang, as any...
is a snifter, is that Nut? Having a snifter for a drink?
Snifter, that could have been a Nut. I don't know when that started. Have a snifter, have a short one. Evasions always... The number of ways of saying goodbye, I think I've listed it somewhere, that you could say toof, toof, you could say tinkety-tonk, you could say...
toof, toof.
Toof, toof. I don't know what toof, toof was about, but it is there in one of his books. There are about a dozen ways of saying, oh, honk, honk was another.
This is where the mystery of Wodehouse really begins, as far as I'm concerned. In this intensely private man, extremely nice man, who invented everything. I mean, he invented a world. It's a marvelous world. It is an escapist world, you know, it's not... And I suppose that's why most people read Wodehouse, so they go into this extraordinary world of his. And while it seems to be escapist, we now know from Murphy that to some extent it existed.
To most of us casual observers given to snap judgments, the lot of an earl dwelling in marble halls with vassals and serfs at his side probably seems an enviable one. A lucky stiff, we say to ourselves, as we drive off in our charabanc after paying ½ a crown to be shown over the marble halls. And in many cases, of course, we would be right. But not in that of Clarence, 9th Earl of Emsworth. There was a snake in his Garden of Eden, a crumpled leaf in his bed of roses, a grain of sand in his spiritual spinach. He had good health, a large income, and a first-class ancestral home with gravel soil, rolling parkland, and all the conveniences. But these blessings were rendered null and void by the fact that the pure air of the district in which he lived was polluted by the presence of a man he was convinced had evil designs on that preeminent pig, Empress of Blandings.
When you read a Blandings novel, they all start off on the terraces of Blandings Castle. Here are the terraces, the rose gardens, the balustrade, looking out over the lake, which features in every Blandings novel 21 times altogether. And, of course, down the steps around the corner is the lawn where Galahad Threepwood always installed his hammock under the cedar tree, where he could counsel and comfort to worried butlers or anxious young men or irate countesses. Let's go and have a look.
It would be easy to dismiss Lieutenant Colonel Norman Murphy as just another English eccentric. In fact, his book, In Search of Blandings, has a breathtaking scholarly thoroughness. Murphy has journeyed through record offices, Somerset House, and all the locations associated with Wodehouse in a quest to find the true models of his fictional world.
How are you sure this is the right place?
If you can get anywhere else in England within 8 miles of where Wodehouse lived, with 15 of the factors you should have out of 16, you're not doing badly. Every single thing he wrote about in Blandings Castle, in the estate, except for one, is here. Every single factor. There are no other places in England with the lake, the terraces, the Greek temple, the pond and the kitchen garden, the cottage in the wood, laid out exactly as he described them.
The fact is that Wodehouse's fiction is often a brilliantly distilled version of his own experience. One of his early novels, for example, Mike and Smith, deals with the brief, unhappy period of his life just after he left school to work in the city.
The city received Mike with the same aloofness with which the more western portion of London had welcomed him on the previous day. Nobody seemed to look at him. He was permitted to alight at St. Paul's and make his way up Queen Victoria Street without any demonstration. He followed the human stream till he reached the Mansion House and eventually found himself at the massive building of the new Asiatic Bank Limited. The difficulty now was how to make an effective entrance. There was the bank, and here was he. How had he better set about breaking it to the authorities that he'd positively arrived and was ready to start earning his £4.10 per mensem?
His position would have been really a very lowly one of clerk, and he was one of very many clerks in those days. The Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank in London, when Wodehouse was with it, 1900 to 1902, I think, was really very much overstaffed with junior clerks. There were, in fact, 48 junior clerks in the bank at that time, most of them waiting for orders to go to the Far East.
So it's like school?
Very much like school, yes. In fact, people have often said that there was quite a public school atmosphere to the place.
And I opened this ledger and saw the gleaming front page, and I thought, well, something ought to be done about this. So I wrote a very comic description of the opening of the new ledger, the grand opening, crowds in Lombard Street, and me being presented at Buckingham Palace and so on. And after I'd finished it, I was screamingly funny, I suddenly thought, well, I don't think the head of the department will think much of this, so I decided to get a sharp knife and cut out the page. And I cut this page out, and all was well. The NIGEL looked all right to me. But the cashier had been feuding with the stationers and been trying for weeks to get something on the stationers. And he rang up the stationers and said, do you call yourselves stationers, sending a letter with an imperfect letter with a front page missing? They said, no, of course we didn't do that. They said somebody must have cut the page out. And the cashier said, no, nobody was such an imbecile as cut the front page of a letter out. And they said, well, you must have an imbecile in your department. Have you? And he said, why, yes, I was P.G. Wodehouse, and I was put under the lights and grilled and had to come clean. But the story always ends, when I tell it, as that I got sacked and became a writer. But as a matter of fact, nothing happened. I was forgiven.
On leaving the bank, Wodehouse started out on his own as a writer, and after completing a series of successful school stories, in 1904 he set sail for America, where he wrote musicals for Broadway, and where, in due course, the world of showbiz provided him with a wife. He liked sort of soubrettes, I think is the word, or sort of gay young things from the chorus.
Yes.
Which is, I suppose, the girl he married was a...
Well, she's said to be, but I think she was only in the chorus when he met her. She was married to a man called Rowley who died, and she had Leonora, and then he died and she had no money, and I think she was in the chorus when Plum met her, but that's never been very well established, and she was alive when I was doing research for the book and was fairly anxious for this not to come out, I think.
And he met your grandmother in New York?
He met her in New York, yes.
What was she doing?
She was out there with a repertory company. She appeared on the stage, and she said she was working on the stage to raise school fees to send my mother to school back here in Bromley, which is what happened. And they met up, I think, in this way, that Plum had a male friend who said to Plum, I'll bring my girl, you bring yours, let's have a night out. Plum said rather sadly, well, I haven't got a girlfriend. So his friend said, well, I'll bring my girlfriend's girlfriend. And that was Ethel, my grandmother. And they met, I think, early in August, and they were married late in September the same year. So it was a whirlwind romance on any view.
In a way, Ethel was a bit like the Memsahib all over again.
Yes.
But then the Memsahib being his mother.
Yeah, that's right. Perhaps only just a little more acid, I think.
Oh, Ethel. Oh,
yes.
Oh, yes.
She doesn't sound easy to live with.
No, she wasn't.
I would
really.
think impossible is
I think that's when I got the ulcer from her.
Yes.
She was very gregarious. She was at her best when she was in the middle of a party, having fun, and that to him was absolute anathema. And I often think that she doesn't get enough credit for what she did for him, in this sense, that she made this enormous sacrifice to keep people away from him, because she realized fully that if some stranger was coming to lunch or coming to see them, that would put him off his concentration. And he'd worry, certainly in his later years, he used to worry for 2 or 3 days before someone came to the house, what on earth was he going to say to them, and what should happen, and so forth. And she protected him to a very considerable degree, and gave him his freedom, and really took over completely running their lives.
There is no doubt that Wodehouse's marriage was a harmonious love match, and that his vivacious and forceful partner was his prop and stay to the end of his life. One of the most significant things about the period of his internment is that she wasn't there to make certain crucial decisions for him.
On September the 8th, exactly 5 weeks from the day of our arrival, we were paraded, and this time informed not that anyone had received a parcel, but that we were to pack our belongings and proceed once more to an unknown destination. On leaving Huy, we had been given half a loaf of bread apiece and half a sausage, and after we'd been 32 hours on the train, we got another half-loaf and some soup. The journey to Torst took 3 days and 3 nights, and it was rendered more trying than it need have been by the fact that we were not given the slightest clue as to how long it was going to last. We just sat and sat and sat, and the train rolled on and on. It was rather like being on the ship of the dead in Outward Bound. It seemed to us quite possible that the engine driver had been told just to keep on taking us about the countryside until headquarters had cleaned up a heavy lot of outstanding business on its desk and was at leisure to get around to deciding where it wanted us dumped. The conviction to which we came on the second day was that he had lost his way and was too proud to make inquiries. Torst is no beauty spot. It lies in the heart of the sugar beet country, and if you're going in for growing sugar beets on a large scale, you have to make up your mind to dispense with wild romantic scenery. There is a flat dullness about the countryside which has led many a visitor to say, if this is Upper Silesia, what must Lower Silesia be like? And the charm of any lunatic asylum never strikes you immediately. You have to let it grow on you.
Would the guards come up to him and say, Mr. Wodehouse,
I don't know that the guards would have done, but certainly the commandant knew who he was, and the Sonderführers, they knew who he was.
And they'd read the books in translation?
I should imagine the Sonderführers, in actual fact, had read them in English, because they spoke very good English. But there were translations, and I mean, he was apparently had a large following in Germany.
The proposition there is that the Germans got their misunderstanding of England to some extent through reading Wodehouse, and they thought that the aristocracy that were represented by these Drones Club idiots were soft, at least, and could that they were important as people to be expected. And then there was the story that Malcolm Muggeridge tells of the Germans having sent over a spy and dropped him by parachute, either on purpose or by mistake, on Dartmoor, dressed in a top hat and spats, thinking he'd get away with it. He was immediately captured. I'm not sure that's true, but it's a good story.
The Germans may have thought they understood Wodehouse. What they didn't understand was that his satire masks a profound affection for his subject. Whether talking about pigs or butlers, his comedy always comes out of a charitable bewilderment.
There was a man, I forget the name, it's well appropriate, I think it was a man called Death, who went to interview him. And he asked him whether he believed in an afterlife. And Plum said, well, some days I think I do, and other days, no, I don't. Which is the only sane answer you could have. He wasn't prepared to be categorical.
So readers looking for profundity will be disappointed.
Disappointed? They'd be mental to start.
Feeding the animal. Ronnie's face clouded. He was vague as to what pigs ate, but he knew that they needed a lot of whatever it was. From his brief reading of Augustus Whipple on the care of the pig, he seemed to remember it was important that the pig should not be allowed to skip meals. It would be no use restoring to Lord Emsworth a skeleton empress. The cuisine must be maintained at its existing level, or the thing might just as well be left undone. For the first time, he began to doubt the quality of his recent inspiration. Scanning the desk with knitted brows, he took from the bookrest a volume entitled Pigs and How to Make Them Pay. A glance at page 61, and his misgivings were confirmed. Yes, said Ronnie, having skimmed through all the stuff about barley meal and maize meal and linseed meal and potatoes and separated milk or buttermilk. This, he now saw clearly, was no one-man job.
Where are you going to take us to next?
Probably the most famous spot in the entire estate, the pigsty of the immortal Empress of Blandings.
Who was a Berkshire?
A black Berkshire sow, and of course won the prize at the Shropshire Show 3 years running, a feat unparalleled in porcine history. Round this way. Ah, here we are. I'm lost. Hold it, please. I'm lost. There's a way through there to the bit. I am physically lost, you know. There should be a way. Fun? I know. There's a way round there somewhere. Where can we see a minute? There's a way round here somewhere. Can you see where it is? Shall we walk down there again, but please, see if we can find it. Thanks. Well, this is the sty of the beloved Empress itself, the Empress of Blandings, specially installed here now because the Earl of Bradford realises that this is the real Blandings estate. In real life, of course, the Empress of Blandings was based on a cow, a Jersey cow, belonging to a friend of P.G. Woodhouse's. But rather than satirise the friend directly, he made her a pig instead. She was a black Berkshire sow, exactly as this one is, and whenever Lord Emworth was missing, he could be found leaning negligently over the rails, looking lovingly at his prize pig, just like this.
I think somewhere I read that Wodehouse got the idea of the Earl of Emsworth because he'd read somewhere that a certain Duke or Earl had said his happiest moment in life had been looking at his prize pig.
Probably, yes. That I didn't know, but I think it is true.
Because you yourself were a breeder of pigs.
Yes, I was. Now, I used to keep 50 pedigree breeding sows and about 3 or 4 pedigree bulls. And usually when they farrowed, if I was around, I'd always go and watch them and help them. In fact, I've given the kiss of life to a piglet.
Lord Emsworth was obliged to fortify himself with another look at the Empress, who was now at about her 54th thousandth calorie. Galahad, he said, sinking his voice almost to a whisper. The man has shown me the photograph of an enormous pig. He thrust it under my nose with an evil leer and said, Emsworth, old cocky whacks, meet the winner of this year's Fat Pig Medal of the Shropshire Agricultural Show. His very words. But what was the photograph of? Don't you understand, said Lord Emsworth. This is a new pig. He imported it a day or two ago from a farm in Kent. Queen of Matchingham, he calls it. Galahad, Lord Emsworth said, his voice vibrating with emotion. With this Queen of Matchingham in the field, Empress of Blandings will have to strain every nerve to repeat her triumphs of the last 2 years. You don't mean it's fatter than the Empress?
The Royal is the main event in England. If you can get even a card at the Royal, you're doing ever so well. But they're all really a friendly lot, and we laugh at each other if we lose and everything.
People often talk in the Wodehouse books about nobbling pigs, stealing pigs. It'd be quite a job to steal a pig, wouldn't it?
No, but there used to be a few little tales years ago at the shows where they'd go along sometimes and put a drop of water in one pig's ear. So when he went in the ring, he kept shaking his head, like, you know, and any little bits like that. But I don't think anything's ever really been not too bad. Oh, sorry.
She's having a drink now. Perhaps we can... and you're going to feed her? Give her some apples?
Oh, yeah, I can get her some food.
Great.
Come on. You're coming up to the third, missus. And a lot of the prizes is won at home with training and walk around and stand at the right time so they catch the judge's eye and they'll stand nicely and turn around when you want them to.
It's a bit like ballet dancers,
More
really.
or less, and he can come and have a feel if they're quiet and see if they're all right, look at the nail, see if it's all right. And a lot of work is done at home.
Pigs are temperamental. With them, things have to be just so. Remove the custodian to whose society they have become accustomed and substitute a stranger, and they refuse their meals and pine away. Incredible as it seemed that a level-headed pig could detect charm in his pigman, the owner knew that it was so. A journalist who came to interview me at Tost observed that it was no Blandings Castle, but its inmates were as much obsessed with nutrition as Lord Emsworth's prize-winning beast. We were 1,300 internees with but a single thought. A bevy of tapeworms could not have been more preoccupied with the matter of nourishment than the inmates of E Log 8. At the sight of it, even if it was only barley soup, our hearts leapt up as if we'd beheld a rainbow in the sky. We sprang at the black pudding like wolves at a Russian peasant. Even a windjammer sailor, a man who, having passed his formative years in the society of Weevilly biscuits, might have been supposed to be above the human weakness, never failed to show visible emotion when the whistle blew for meals. You may take it as a fact that no matter how apparently absorbed an internee may be in some passing task or recreation, his thoughts are really on his last, or his next, meal. And when he talks of little else.
Even incarceration in a padded cell didn't stop Wodehouse working. While he was at Tost, he worked on a novel, Money in the Bank, and worked up his diary into a series of talks for his fellow internees. Can you tell me about these talks that he wrote? Were they camp entertainment, sort of 8 o'clock on Friday, everybody... That's the sort of thing?
Yes. You know, a talk to last presumably about 20 minutes, and I went along to them with everybody else. I wasn't so much concerned with it because I hadn't been a member of the trek from Hui to wherever it was. But the people who had, they sort of fell about laughing. It was most, you know, highly enjoyable.
It was these pieces that formed the basis of a series of talks Wodehouse broadcast to America over the German radio in the summer of 1941.
Summing up my experience as a jailbird, I would say that the prison is all right for a visit, but I wouldn't live there if you gave me the place. On my part, at any rate, there was no moaning at the bar when I left loose. I was glad to go. The last I saw of the old alma mater was the warder closing the door of the van and standing back with the French equivalent of right away. He said au revoir to me, which I thought a little tactless.
What about the broadcasts themselves? Because those talks that you mentioned that he gave in the camp were really the basis for those...
Yes, they were those... I mean, now I've read them since. The only thing that has changed is that there are the 2 introductory paragraphs at the beginning of the first talk, and there's the winding up paragraph at the end of the last talk. Otherwise, they were the 4 talks which he wrote, in October, I suppose, of 1940, and delivered to a very appreciative audience they were Saturday afternoons, I think.
The United States was not at war with Germany, and these broadcasts were simply made to reassure American fans who'd written to him at Tost that Wodehouse was alive and well. But the broadcasts were picked up by the BBC monitoring service at Caversham, and they were carefully orchestrated to cause a sensation. The then Minister of Information, Duff Cooper, forced the BBC to allow a Daily Mirror journalist, William Connor, to broadcast a postscript to the 9 o'clock news on July the 15th.
I have come to tell you tonight of the story of a rich man trying to make his last and greatest sale, that of his own country. It is a somber story of honor pawned to the Nazis for the price of a soft bed in a luxury hotel. It is the record of P.G. Wodehouse ending 40 years of money-making fun with the worst joke he ever made in his life. the only wisecrack he ever pulled that the world received in silence.
Connor's broadcast, as the BBC's lawyer pointed out, was libelously inaccurate. Indeed, the BBC later apologised for transmitting it. All later evidence demonstrates there was no deal of any kind. Werner Plack, the German Foreign Office official who set up the broadcasts, emphatically denied that Wodehouse accepted release as the price for his harmless performance on radio. He was approaching 60, the age at which he would have been released anyway. But, though the lawyer in charge of the MI5 investigation into the Wodehouse affair after the war cleared him of all but 1 or 2 minor technical offences, the timing of the broadcast could not have been worse.
Well, of course, it made it impossible for me to come to England, which I should have liked to do very much.
Why did you feel it was impossible? Because...
Well, I mean, the atmosphere was so difficult. I mean, you can't go to a place where you're very unpopular.
You felt pretty bitter at the time yourself, didn't you?
No, I never feel bitter about anything. I just felt uncomfortable about it. I was sorry it had happened. But then all my friends stuck to me. They didn't seem to make any difference to them.
But the climate of opinion about you changed pretty quickly after the war, even before the end of the war, didn't it? I mean...
Did it, do you think?
Don't you?
Oh, I thought it took some time.
I don't think I was very pleased when he did the broadcast from Berlin in the last war, because although he didn't say anything, the fact that he must have known, everybody knew how Hitler behaved and what a monster he was. And I mean, if I or anybody else, or you, I'm sure, had said, oh, do you mind coming into the studio and making a broadcast on the wireless, one would have turned around and said, go and get lost. And not that he was anti-English, but I mean, I thought it was a terrible thing, that.
As an American, I almost wish to apologize, because America was not in the war then, but P.G. Wodehouse had many, many very loyal, very close friends who were extremely worried about him. And all they wanted to find out is, where was Plum? Was he okay? And there was an American reporter that went over there and interviewed Plum. However, it was a garbled message that got back. And all P.G. Wodehouse wanted to do was show the usual British stiff upper lip. Hey, it's a bad situation, but I'm handling it just fine. He did it in the way that he'd written all his novels, by making light of a situation instead of magnifying its worst. He was unaware of what was happening in England at the time. Mm-hmm. He was offered the chance to talk to the United States, to his close personal friends in the United States. And so he did it in 5 tape-recorded broadcasts. These weren't done live. He tape-recorded these broadcasts. So there was a speculation that he was given a report after each broadcast what was happening. That's completely untrue. He recorded to the United States, forgetting that once airwaves go out in one direction, they can be heard in another direction. If he had thought of that, maybe he might not have done it. But as an American, I can always say, I'm sorry, he tried to reach us with his whereabouts.
He gave the broadcast, they were recorded on wax, and then it was all too late, and later they were put out on the English wavelength. There was nothing he could do then to stop this. And of course, immediately he heard of the furore they'd caused, he remained silent for the rest of the war.
Yes, he was also completely cut off from news information. He'd been in internment, he had no access to... He didn't... When he was picked up by the Germans, the situation was not...
That's a very good point.
Pre-Blitz, isn't it? It's all that. It's the phony war, almost.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, as you may know, in some American military college after the war, they actually used the transcripts of his broadcasts as demonstrating how you could subtly write anti-enemy, anti-German propaganda.
And also all this talk in the newspapers about Wodehouse the traitor.
Yes, that's right. Yes, because I was going to a women's sewing class. We were making things for the soldiers, bedroom slippers and different things. And this woman started this one big woman. Well, she said, I tell you what I've done today. She said, I've got hold of all Woodhouse's books. She said, and I've torn them up, and what I haven't torn, I've burnt, she said. And she said, oh, this is one of me. So she went on this, so then I turned on her, and I said, he happens to be my brother-in-law, you know. And I gave her what for, and she stopped.
Because he was a victim, really, wasn't he, of a kind of horrible thing that happens in war, propaganda.
Oh, very much so, yes.
They can tell such lies, can't they?
Yeah.
It destroyed him, really, didn't it?
Well, it did. It was terribly sad and really very unfair. But to be fair to the people who were being bombed in England, they were living on their nerves. It was ferocious war, and anything that anybody did, seemed to do, that was out of line, you know, talking to the enemy, couldn't be allowed. But it should have been put that way.
It's really a story about how truth gets destroyed by war, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Or humour.
Yes, and by uncareful people who are writing and broadcasting sometimes, you know. But they're luckily very much in the minority.
No, I think if one has done a foolish thing, you've got to take the consequences. Just feel it's a pity it happened.
Looking back on that now, you feel that it was a foolish thing to have done?
Very. Never occurred to me at the time.
But do you ever feel homesick for England?
Yes, I suppose I do occasionally.
What do you feel homesick for when you remember England? What are the things you miss?
Football and cricket. I don't know if cricket's... I'm afraid it's not the same sort of thing now as it used to be, but... Oh, I don't know. And of course, I like to see the English countryside. That's always rather alluring.
Any places in particular?
No actual town or village or anything, but anywhere in Worcestershire or Shropshire or anything like that.
I think it's we Dutch have another approach to the affair. I think Wodehouse was crushed between the German propaganda and the English, how you call it, Office of Information. You know, the Americans were not involved at the time, so they took every measure to show them how nice and honest the Germans would be. So they have made them make this broadcast. But in England, well, you had the Dunkirk affair, you had the bombings. The English people were suffering, and they needed a scapegoat. So Wodehouse made a talk, and he was made a scapegoat. I think that's it.
Anyone who can give pleasure to people and make them laugh for 70 years without malice or cruelty or sex must be a great writer. And I follow the word the Queen Mother used last year when she unveiled the Platform in London. She said all through her life, after hard times and a hard day, she went to bed in Wodehouse, for she went to sleep with a smile on her face.
In making this film, Norman, I have the impression that we started out with a view of a secular saint, very much of the kind of man you've been talking about. But I still feel there's something that we haven't explained. There is a mystery behind him that is not... He's not quite as simple as he often appears.
The mystery is simply this. A quiet, shy man who works so hard that every writer in England said, that is the best writer we've got. He worked so hard, he didn't have time for, if you like, the social niceties. He didn't have time for politics. He was so busy working, he just got on with it. All he wanted to do was to write 6 days a week and go and watch rugby matches on Saturday afternoon. And because he was so simple, people said, there must be more than that. There doesn't have to be.
When you think of yourself, if you ever do, and we know that you find that you're very reluctant to do that, or to talk about yourself, but do you think of yourself as an Englishman still?
I don't know, it's difficult to say. Yes, I suppose I do.